So today's video is comparing various different ports of the very awesome arcade game R-Type, which released by Outrun back in 1987. Now, a lot of people's got very good fond memories of this game through visuals alone. One of the things which actually attracted me to this game back in the day, and still does, is the awesome neon colours. So of course, just like any other popular arcade game from back in the day, it would have various ports on microcomputers, on consoles. Now, we're looking at several different versions of R-Type. This is for the original 1987 game, so anything which was created Super Nintendo wise, such as Super R-Type, is not going to be included because they're not actually the same game. Having said that, we do have some Nintendo systems in here, and even ZX Spectrum. There are some very good ports of R-Type, and this one was very hard to judge, to establish, to me personally, which version of this got the best version. So here we go. So first off in this list, we have got the Amstrad CPC version of R-Type. This one was released in 1989. As you can see, this game is ultra slow, lots of lag going on, and of course old hardware has limitations, but from my experience of Amstrad CPC gaming, there's a hell of a lot better than this port, and Amstrad CPC is much more capable of this. As you can see from the colours and the graphics, it almost looks like a very cheap port of the ZX Spectrum version, which we'll get to soon. There's no music in the CPC version of R-Type. The sound effects are very bland, like I say, very laggy, and the controls wasn't too responsive either, very slow to play, and like I said before, the CPC was much more capable of this. Next up, we have got the Atari ST port of R-Type, and this one released back in 1988, so the same year as the arcade game itself. I think Atari actually had a heads up with this game. So I think there are slight latency issues with the controlling in this game. Visuals for the game, sprites, everything else are very average for a 16-bit micro game. Music only and no sound effects by the seams of it from the first stage I've played. I did find that the sprites in the game were actually too big, and as you can see from the gameplay footage, it was moving so fast. So combined with having very large sprites, the game itself is moving so quickly, it was just very hard to play, and it's also slightly laggy. So yeah, for Atari ST fans, I'm sure this isn't good news, but I do have my reasons for rating this one this low in this list. Next up, we have got the original classic Game Boy. This one actually released back in 1991, so a few years after the arcade machine released. Now, something I need to respect with this version is that, of course, this is monochrome and it's got limitations. It's portable for starters, but having said that, some portable games, some are even better than actual console versions sometimes, and this one's no exception. The music and the sound effects in this port for the Game Boy is really good. Sprites are much smaller, and some have actually been taken away. It's got very good smooth scrolling with occasional flicker and very slight slowdown. Like I said in the introduction, R-Type has got many good ports on it. The only reason I've ranked this one this low down, because quite literally it does have some slowdown. Next up, we have got the ZX Spectrum port of R-Type. This one released in 1988, so the same year as the arcade machine, and it's actually a very good port. So, of course, ZX Spectrum graphics are very colourful, and I think that reflects the actual arcade machine it's copying, those neon colours, that type of thing. Now, some of you will look at this gameplay and think to yourself, this should have been lower down the list, but I think this game is really nice to play. It does have a small screen, but it's so smooth, and it is slightly crammed, but it's definitely not too bad. And by crammed, I mean there's a lot of enemies to tackle, but like I say, given the machine's limitations and a little bit of sprite flicker here and there, it really is a fantastic port. And if you're a ZX Spectrum fan, I'm pretty sure you would have played this one back in the day. It's highly rated with ZX Spectrum fans. It's a really great port of R-Type. Next up on the list, we have got another microcomputer's port of R-Type. This is the MSX. So a lot of people in Britain didn't have an MSX back in the day. A lot of people had ZX Spectrum or C64. However, MSX users could play R-Type. Now, it's not a bad port, but as you can see from the gameplay on the screen right now, there is lag. The sprites are moving fantastic, very good in fact, but MSX moving is a bit of a limitation of the machine itself from my experience of playing MSX games in the past. So overly playable game, and it does suffer with the frame rate given the hardware limitations, but it does actually have music and sound effects. I think the music sounds a little bit like the Sega Master System's version, which I'm going to be looking at fairly soon, and it's also improvised on sprites used to other versions. For example, the MSX version, there's more mechs than on the other versions. And it's also got a full screen, so really, all in all, the MSX version of R-Type really isn't that bad. The only big issue I got with it is the actual lag, but like I say, that's really down to the machine hardware itself, and that couldn't be helped. Next up, we have got the Commodore 64 version of R-Type. Again, just like the other microcomputer versions, this one also released in 1988. I didn't have this one back in the day, and of course the C64 was my first ever system I owned, but I knew about this game a couple of years later in the arcades. Now, as a massive C64 fanboy, I'm afraid to say this one doesn't get any higher up in my list in this. Now, the reason for this is that although it's got some very awesome music in it produced by the SID chip with sound effects too, it seriously sacrifices some parts of the game, such as some sprites are missing, and that circle, what you see halfway through the first stage, it doesn't actually spin, and I think that's what made R-Type's first stage something very special, that spinning wheel which is shooting at you. By far is one of the hardest versions of R-Type that I've played, and it does suffer with slight sprite flicker, but again, just like other microcomputers, that's a limitation of the hardware, where so many things is happening on screen all at once. Next up in the list, we have got the Game Boy Color's port of R-Type. So this one actually released around 11 years after the arcades game came out back in 1999. Now, like I say, going back to the original Game Boy port of this, some ports, especially on portable systems, are very impressive, and the Game Boy Color's port of this is no exception. That's why this one's halfway through this list. It's got great performance with very little lag in it. Sound effects and music is also included, very fluid gameplay. There is some sacrifices with sprites, but we can allow that for limitations, just like microcomputers had limitations. But for what it is, a portable system, is a very, very nice release of R-Type, and I was really impressed with this version of it. Next up in my list, we have got the Sega Master System's port of R-Type. This one released back in 1988 alongside the microcomputers releases of this. Something which was really impressive to me is such responsive gameplay, and it was very smooth to play too. It also came with music as well as sound effects, and it's got such a nice field to exploring with your spaceship. Nothing's too crammed in the game like the Atari ST version, and the sprites are just very nicely sized. nice. It's a really faithful port to the arcade source. Next up, we have got the Commodore Amiga's port of R-Type. This one released in 1989, and of course at the time it would have been competing against the Atari ST, and we know where the Atari ST's port of R-Type ended on my list. So what made this version much better than the Atari ST's version was everything, really. It had a nice feel to play, and unlike the Atari ST's port of it, the sprites in this version was actually nicely done. They weren't too big, and the gameplay wasn't too fast, and that's why I've ranked the Amiga's version so high up in this list. It's a very nice port, and I think all Commodore Amiga fans would have played this one back in 1989, 1990. I would have been really chuffed with this port of R-Type if I had an Amiga, if I was fortunate enough to have an Amiga back in the day. Next up in the list, we have got a version of R-Type which a lot of people might not have played or known about, but this one is for the PC Engine or TurboGrafx CD. So one standout feature of this version of R-Type is its rendition of the theme music, the Stage 1 music. It's got its own unique take on it with some nice piano sound in the background, and of course, like most iconic games, music is just as important as gameplay itself, and that's where this version really stands out. And music is awesome. On top of that, it's got really nice vibrant visuals with neon colors when you're shooting things. It's really nice, and it's a very faithful to the arcade original, despite the music being different. Despite that, it's a superb version of it, and I highly recommend any R-Type fan or shoot 'em up fan to play this version. It's also got no sprite flicker either, so it's a win-win with this one. Now, back in 1989, if you happen to have had a Sharp X68000, if you was in the west of the world and not in Japan, you would have realised at that point that the R-Type port of this was near arcade perfection, 100%. It's certainly one of the most difficult games out of all of these versions of R-Type to play. I really did struggle with this port of R-Type. It was really ramped up, and the really good feature with this particular port of it is that you have the ability to change between difficulty modes, and even the easiest mode on this version of it was hard as nails. It wasn't easy to play. Having said that, it was near arcade perfection, and for anyone who's yet to experience Sharp X68000, it's a superb Japanese microcomputer from the 1980s, and it's highly worth checking out. And at first place in this countdown, I ranked the PlayStation, OG PlayStation's version of R-Type. This is on the R-Types disc, and this one, just like the Sharp X68000, is near arcade perfection. The only reason this one actually won the first place is just a matter over the difficulty level. The PS1 version of R-Type, the difficulty level was really toned down. It's a little bit more playable. But like I say, the Sharp X68000 version of this was insanely difficult, even at the easiest level of difficulty. So that's it. What do you think of my choices? What would you have ranked in first place? Or, you know, do you think Atari ST deserved a higher place than what I actually placed it? Anyways, let us know in the comments what you actually think of this, and give us some feedback. So in today's video of which version did I rank number one, we're checking out Outrun. So of course, Outrun is an arcade racing game produced in 1986 by Sega, and it was a pioneering game for its time, known for its graphics and its really awesome gameplay. Someone actually recommended me doing this one, but I already had it on my list. How could I not forget Outrun? So unlike yesterday's R-Type video, unfortunately, Outrun had some very, very bad ports of this, but we're going to cover that. Now, just bear in mind that we're going to cover portable systems, 8-bit systems, 16-bit, even 32-bit systems, and just remember that even portable versions of games sometimes can be much better than their counterparts. So anyways, without further ado, this is ranking Outrun. Now, let me make this clear. I'm not a religious person, I'm more of agnostic, but after playing this ZX Spectrum port of Outrun, I felt like converting to a religion. So anyways, the ZX port of this is absolutely terrible. Although my speedometer was going around 190 to 200 miles per hour, the game more or less seemed like a slug walking. The spec had limited colours, of course, but green just didn't work with this game. The controls felt very sluggish and really unresponsive. The only good redeeming thing about this port was the music. I literally felt like I was drifting into a coma whilst playing this version. Kids back in the day likely cried back in the day after playing this. Likely the slowest racing game I've ever played. The Atari 2600 had better racing games like this, such as Enduro. We all know that Spec-E was underpowered in certain aspects, but Chase HQ, which came out a couple of years later on the Spec-E, was one of the best among the ports of that particular game. So ZX Spectrum version of Outrun, avoid it. Next up, we have got the 1987 release on the Amstrad CPC. This version was almost close to being the worst in this list. The only reason it wasn't is because it had a few more colours than the Spectrum port. This port was just this slow, boring, no music at all, but some door-breaking sound effects, which just didn't cut it. The perception of speed was pretty much off as well. It actually didn't feel like you was moving at all at some point. If I didn't know a little better, I'd say this was a direct port of the Spectrum version with a few extra added colours to it. There was no major introduction, that iconic introduction with the flag and the people. Again, I truly feel sorry for the kids who had this once. Next up on this list, we have the Atari ST's 1988 release of this. So, first of all, you've got the actual ability in this port to enable or disable the music. The gameplay, on the other hand, is very sluggish, specifically very sluggish when you're steering left or right. Music seems to abruptly skip from one track or another without fading. Didn't actually feel like I was driving, but rather just turning left and right just for the sake of it. There was no starting point with the flag and the peep at the start of the first track. The use of colour palette is very nice in this version though. In-game music sound much like a C64 game, that SID chip sound. Perception of speed is very much off too, so not particularly a great port. Next up on the list, we have got the MSX2 version of Outrun. So this one released back in 1988, and this one was specifically a very interesting port. The game starts off just like any generic racing game from that era. Other cars on the track though were missing, which I was finding a little bit strange. The steering felt like being on ice. It lacked that feeling of turning the vehicle as you're steering left and right. Sprite of the car wasn't badly drawn. Passing breeze music was mediocre, pretty typical of that age, nothing spectacular. Edges of the track were very pixelated though, compared to other versions of this game. Colours used wasn't nothing too special either, but to be mindful, this is essentially an 8-bit micro game, and it certainly makes the CPC and Spectrum versions look even worse than what they were. Okay, next up we have got the IBM PC DOS release of Outrun. This one released back in 1989. It's not particularly the greatest version of Outrun for several reasons. Firstly, that awesome summary type music has been absolutely demolished by this version. I just want to turn it off, to be honest, after 60 seconds of listening to it. Like other ports, there are no other cars on the track as you're racing. The use of colouring, however, is fairly good on this version. Steering the car left or right isn't really that good either. It almost felt like the MSX2 version, where it felt a little bit like I was steering left and right whilst being on ice at the same time. The good thing is, though, that the race actually starts with the iconic banner. Next up, we have got the 1988 release for the Commodore Amiga. It's a fairly good port of Outrun. It comes with music and sound effects, and much like the Atari ST version, you can actually disable or enable music whilst in game. The speed perception didn't feel too bad, and steering felt pretty good too. I did notice on several occasions that my car would drive through obstacles and other cars without any form of collision detection. Again, no grand entrance gate with the flags and the people when the game starts. Nice use of colour palette too, which is similar to the source material. So overall, a fairly good port of this. Next up, we have got the 1987 release of Outrun for the C64. This is actually a fairly good port. It's cut down on colours due to limitations of the C64 hardware. Very smooth to play with no slowdowns. Music is very faithful to the arcade original thanks to the superior SID chip. Speed perception is quite average in this port. This version also features music as well as braking sound effects. There's no grand entrance starting point with people hanging around. Steering left and right was very smooth and felt like I was actually playing a game. Next up, we have got the Sega Master System's 1989 release of Outrun. So the first thing I noticed when playing the Master System port of this was, where were the other cars on the track? The music to me actually sounded better on the Game Gear version, which I'm going to look at soon. Speed perception was pretty much spot on, as were the steering controls, which felt pretty tight. In terms of colours used, the Master System port was fairly faithful given its available palette of colours. This port also features a grand opening of the game. No lag whatsoever. If it wasn't for the absence of other cars, this would have made it slightly higher on this list. Next up on this countdown, we have got the Sega Game Gear's release of Outrun, which released back in 1991. When people say portable versions aren't fair to compare with main console versions, Game Gear's version of Outrun is a very good example of how some portable games can actually beat main console versions. So a really good part of this game is how fluid it runs. It features very good rendition of Pass and Breeze, the stage music, with sound effects added to at the same time. Speed perception is also there, and the steering feels really tight to control. Colours used are also good for this little portable version. Highly recommended, and if I was a kid with a Game Gear rather than a Game Boy, I would have been very happy with this version. Next up in this list, we have got the 1990 PC release or TurboGrafx 16 release of Outrun. Oddly enough, the first thing that struck me with this port is, why is the sky a light green? And why isn't the C on the side at all like in the other versions? This port does have the ability to disable car sounds and music too. Speed perception in the PC engine isn't that bad at all, just an odd choice of colour scheme used. It does have the grand iconic entrance to the first stage though. In terms of steering, this port is actually really good. It would have been a little higher in this ranking if it wasn't for the colours used. In second place, we have got the Sega Mega Drive or Sega Genesis release of Outrun. For a 16-bit console port, the Mega Drive or Genesis version was surprisingly really good. Speed perception was there, controlling was extremely tight, weather dynamics looked good when changing stages, there was no slowdowns, and the Pass and Breeze soundtrack sounded very similar to the source material. A very good use of colours too in this game that reflected the arcade original. A very impressive port that many people should have been very happy with at the time of the release of this game. It even had the big entrance to begin the game with, which was a big bonus. And here it is then, in number 1 place I have ranked the Game Boy Advance version of this. This one released back in 2003, and it was actually part of a 4-game cartridge known as the Sega Arcade Gallery. Overly, in my humble opinion, it is the best port. To be honest, I thought the Sega Mega Drive or Genesis version was the much better port until I played this one. The music, for starters, is insanely close to the original, given its technical inferior sound output compared to the Mega Drive or Genesis. The colours are gorgeous and controlling and steering is top notch. The C beside the track as you pass it by looks really nice too. This is a great example that some portable games are actually better than the main console versions. So anyways, that's it for this countdown. What did you think of my choices? What would you have ranked in number 1 place? And just remember, before you get your knickers in a twist, this is an actual subjective video. So my opinion isn't official, it's an opinion, and that's it. But anyways, thanks for watching. So in today's comparison video, we're comparing the various different ports of the 1987 Sega arcade game, which is Shinobi. So Shinobi is a very awesome hack-and slash side-scrolling game. A lot of people have got very fond memories of this, including myself. I remember playing this particular game in the arcade. Now we're only going to concentrate on the actual direct ports of the original arcade game itself. So anything like Cyber Shinobi or Super Shinobi, Revenge of the Shinobi, they're not going to be included because of course those aren't the same game. So we're going to be focused on microcomputer conversions as well as console ports too. So here we go. So we're going to start off this list today with the PC, IBM or DOS version. So what else can I say? This version was truly shocking. It took everything from the arcade original and made it as bad as possible, or so it seems. There was no in-game music. The sound effects sounded a little bit like ping pong. When hiding behind boxes to stand up and shoot an enemy, the box gets in the way and cannot hit them. Sometimes when ducking to avoid a bullet, the bullet kills you anyway, so there's no point in ducking in this port. So collision detection truly is a mess with this DOS version. The choice of colours used in this so-called conversion is a mess, and sprites look very elementary. Controls are really bad too with this version. There is a reason why I have said nothing positive about the DOS version, because there really isn't. You would likely get a better version from a Sinclair ZX80. Okay, next up we have got the MSX version of Shinobi. So as you can see from the gameplay footage, this very much looks like a Spectrum game. In fact, I'd say it was a port or vice versa. It controls okay, it's very laggy as can be expected from the first MSX computer. When you're jumping up and down from levels in the game, it just seems like it takes so long. Collision detection is pretty tight though with this version. I'm sorry, but there's no sound in this version. I couldn't emulate the sound for this particular version of the game, but let's just say it sounds very similar to the sound effects being used within the ZX Spectrum version. Next up, we have got the ZX Spectrum port of Shinobi. So as well as this port was put together, the thing that scores it this low down is a simple factor of color clash, which of course could not be helped at the time of programming this game. Of course, in recent years, talented decoders have found methods to eliminate that color clash in certain instances. The issue is with the Spectrum port is that the enemy bullets are very hard to distinguish between the background and the foreground. I will not knock the gameplay itself or the music. Both of these have been really well assembled. The controls are also very tight in this port too. It is without a doubt a major upgrade from the DOS version, which is impressive in its own right. Next up, we have the C64 version. Although this conversion is missing the iconic music during gameplay, this version actually plays very smoothly with very little tiny sprite flicker. Collision detection is pretty much 100% with the C64 version too. The difficulty level on the C64 is fairly high compared to the others on this list. As in typical C64 fashion, enemies regenerate within split seconds. Sound effects used are very basic too in this version. Colours used are fairly average for C64 and movement isn't that bad. It was ranked this low as other 8-bit micro versions are slightly better with music added too. This isn't an absolute terrible port by no means, but there is better. Next up, we got the Amstrad CPC conversion. So this one's actually a fairly faithful port, an average looking 8-bit micro game with very tight controls. A nice use of colours but overly pixelated, which can't really be helped due to the hardware used for this game. Music wise, the CPC actually captures this very accurately, although the combined use of sound effects drowns the music just a touch. Scrolling wise was pretty good with no lag occurring. Collision detection in the CPC version is also fairly tight in the CPC port, so all round a very good 8-bit micro port of this game. Next up in this list we have the Atari ST port. So this is actually a very mediocre port, very similar to the Commodore Amiga port, which I'm going to be covering a little later. Dual looking use of colour, not exactly the best choice of colours in this conversion. Music is slightly off and not in the same key as the original arcade version. The sound effects are, in my opinion, below average for an ST game. Shinobi is a little awkward to control when landing from a jump. It seems although he is kind of floating, which takes a little while to land, which can make it awkward sometimes to avoid bullets being fired at you. Be prepared to throw that joystick in rage when this happens. Collision detection is actually pretty spot on though, believe it or not. The game is very jerky when scrolling it and jumping. Next up we have the Commodore Amiga. So regretfully, Shinobi on the Amiga is playable but really fairly just a mediocre arcade conversion, given its ability to have looked and sounded much better given the Amiga's hardware. The first thing very noticeable is how ugly the game looks and how dull and uninspired the colours look. Not quite as ugly as the ST conversion. The music itself kind of sounds like it has the right idea but has dropped a key in sounds, just just like the Atari ST version. Game also suffers from jerky frame rates. The only thing I will praise this port for is the bonus rounds. The music actually sounds better during these parts, believe it or not. Very sad to think that an 8-bit system could produce better than this 16-bit version. Collision detection, however, is pretty tight though, so the Atari ST and the Amiga versions are very similar. Next up, we have got the NES port, which is actually underrated in my opinion. It is a very well put together arcade classic conversion. One standout annoyance though was when jumping, a typical cutesy Nintendo sound happens each time, which is pretty off-putting. Collision detection is spot on, colours used are appropriate for source material, the quality of in-game music is very good too for this version. Going back to the early years of Nintendo, I'm actually surprised this title was released at all, given its violent theme. Nevertheless, a very good 8-bit port given its limitations. Finally, the controls are also very tight in this version too. This is definitely recommended, like I say, very underrated Nintendo NES version. In second place, we've actually got the Sega Master System port, a very nice port which captures the source material pretty well for an 8-bit console. Tight controls with a very nice rendition of the theme music, which for added bonus adds some awesome arcade sounding sound effects when collecting hostages and gaining power-ups. Not as pixelated as some other versions too, which is a bonus. Sega also managed to animate Shinobi's squat before he jumps to another platform, which not all other versions had. Color palette used in this port is fairly impressive too. There is no lag in this version and very minimal sprite flicker. The bonus stages are also well designed, to which also run very smoothly too. I have one memory of this game. I asked my mum to get it for me back in the day. Instead, she returned home with Altered Beast. I wasn't happy. And in first place, I've actually rated the PC Engine's or TurboGrafx 16's port of Shinobi. So this was a very close draw between the Sega Master System and the PC Engine's version. I wasn't actually sure which way round to put this, but in the end I decided that the PC Engine's version looked a little bit more like the arcade original, but there wasn't much difference between gameplay and sounds, and if I'm honest, the PC Engine sound was a little bit better than the Sega Master System sound. But all in all, PC Engine's version perfectly encapsulated the arcade feel. Collision detection was spot on, music was great, and it's definitely worth a try if you've not tried this version of Shinobi. Anyways, that's it for this countdown video. Let me know what you think in the comments about my choices, and like always, behave yourself in the comments. This is my personal opinion, and this isn't an official list. So in today's ranking the ports, we are doing Double Dragon. So of course Double Dragon is probably one of the most famous beat-em-ups from the arcades from back in the day, 1987. This one was actually developed and published by Technos Japan, and it features two brothers, Billy and Jimmy, as they attempt to rescue their dojo student Marianne from the Black Warriors. Let me just remind you that there's particular versions of Double Dragon which you won't necessarily see in this video. So we got the Nintendo NES version, which was very different from the arcade version in many ways. We also got Double Dragon for the Atari Jaguar, again a very different version. The Game Gear version also won't be here because that's another game altogether. So we're going to rank the very worst to the very best. There is some hidden gems in here, as well as some extremely bad ports. So without further ado, let's get on with this. First up, we have the port that went down in history as one of the worst games ever. This is Melbourne House's version of Double Dragon. If you haven't played this game, then let this gameplay be a lesson to you. As you can see, sprites appear to be in two halves, as there is a background which displays halfway through their torsos as you move around. No music at all, a very annoying couple of sound effects which really irritates you after a couple of minutes, no ability to roundhouse kick or even flying kick, no larger size sprites for characters like Bobo. Getting past each stage truly feels like an eternity. What you see is what you get. This is one that I had as a kid. I truly didn't appreciate just how terrible it was until years later. The developers clearly just gave up on life with this port. Even when enemies die, they just disappear. There is no proper opening for the game with the garage doors, or no seeing Marianne being taken away from the Shadow Gang. Truly shocking. I still want my £1.99 back from 1990. The only true good thing about this version is spot on collision detection, as well as very good controls. Next up in this list, a couple of years later after the tragic of the Melbourne House port, Ocean Software released its own version of Double Dragon, which was only available on cartridge. This version is a slight step up from the Melbourne House original game, but not that much better either. The good thing, at least with Ocean's version, is that we actually had an option to have music or sound effects, and even a proper opening. The game opens up the garage opening just like the arcade original did too. This version appears to have torsos connected too, which is a win-win really. Flying kicks actually work too in this version. However, collision detection with other sprites is way off in this version. You can see in the gameplay that I wasn't getting too far with this for that reason. It's a real shame, because if Ocean just put a little bit more work into this version, this could have been a winner. Next up, we have the IBM PC or DOS port of Double Dragon. You might notice that the speed might not be accurate, but I did set the emulation to the slowest machine, and this is the slowest the game can actually be played at through emulation. Firstly, playing as Jimmy in the gameplay, you might notice that sprite colors are seriously interfering with background colors, which can get a little overwhelming at times, especially when the game gets busy. This is just one bad thing. Secondly, the controls tend to have a mind of its own. Very hard to pull off flying kicks. At times I had enemies in headlocks, but when kicking heads in, it would not respond. No music, as you can hear. I wasn't actually expecting a Bobo to smash through the wall, but he actually did. As I progressed further into the back alley during Mission 1, I noticed that suddenly characters grew what looked like chicken pops, where some kind of colour clash was presenting itself. I'm not sure. Odd, because as Mission 1 began, Jimmy kind of looked a little bit like a clown with plus signs for eyes. Would I recommend this port? I would likely say no. The slowest performing version definitely goes to the Amstrad CPC port. A real shame, because the colour palette is really nice, and even the sprites are fairly good to look at too. No music, but just sound effects, which is okay given the memory constraints of an 8-bit microcomputer. Now, I did think the game was slow, but when a Bobo crashed out from the wall midway through the first mission, the game got even slower, where it almost became unplayable, and I just gave up. Of course, of this day and age, CPUs can be sped up to make things a little bit better, but the whole purpose of this video is to show you as accurate as possible to how these titles played at the time of release. I think kids of today, when complaining about only running at 60 FPS, should seriously consider watching this game running at a staggering, probably 1.5 FPS at best. Avoid the CPC version of Double Dragon. This is very bad. Now, you might think I am a bit mad to place an Atari 2600 port Double Dragon right here, but let's be honest, firstly, to the coder behind this deserves a big well done for pulling this off. Such a dated machine from the late 1970s, for example, the 2600 version has music, which really isn't a bad rendition given the hardware it's actually working from. The game itself isn't messing around, these baddies mean business. Controller-wise is very basic, but it is what it is, and it actually works fine. The game itself isn't scrolling, but rather single screen, which I was expecting before playing this version. I was even impressed with the hit detection of this port. I am ashamed to place this here way above C64, but I am trying to do a fair assessment on things for this video. Well done Atari 2600 for this release. The Atari 7800 port of Double Dragon is definitely a mean and punishing game. They will beat you and spit on you without even thinking twice about it. The game is a semi-scrolling screen, meaning that the screen will scroll to the right slightly but then change to a new screen entirely. Like I said, severely punishing game and very similar in difficulty to the previous 2600 version. The only reason this was ranked higher is because it's slight more resemblance to the source material. The controls are very tight in this game, but trust me, when those baddies come in groups of 4 at a time, you really don't stand much of a chance at all. Like other versions and the arcade original, the enemies will literally follow the same direction as you walk around in, like a magnet. Once this happens, you are seriously doomed. Now, ZX Spectrum appreciation is a little bit like Marmite. Some love the old school look, just like myself, and some despise it. Despite the obvious colour clash, the Specky conversion is actually pretty good for what it is. Although the hardest in terms of difficulty, or that's just my reflexes going with age, the game felt like it had weight, and by that I mean that sprites actually felt sturdy when punching them, rather than just whizzing around like paper blown in the winds, just like the other various ports of Double Dragon. I was pleasantly surprised with a Bobo caving through the wall, yet the ladders were not climbable. Of course, adding music as well as sound effects to a Spectrum game of this era would have meant sacrificing parts of the game, and so we just got sound effects with this version, which in its defense actually sound a little better than the poor Melbourne House's C64 mess. If you can get past the difficulty level and love the Spectrum look, you would likely have a load of fun with this port. Playing the MSX version was a very nice surprise, although by no means perfect or even brilliant. This port firstly had music, and it was completely different from other versions of Double Dragon. It even had sound effects simultaneously. From MSX games that I have played in the past, they are generally very choppy when moving screen. In other words, MSX couldn't scroll smoothly too well compared with other micros of that time. This game actually did a very good job. Even sprites were fairly nicely drawn, even if their torsos did clash with background colours. I was very surprised to discover that sprite collision detection was actually really good too. Oddly enough, the creator of this port copied the source material but added an almost NES look about it. The sprites look very Nintendo, very cutesy as it were. The controller actually responded well too with this game. I even noticed that while pulling off a flying kick, I could actually do this twice in one go, which was a nice little touch. Like I say, by no means perfect, but definitely an upgrade from the last ports I have mentioned in this video. One thing to mention was the lack of a Bobo smashing the wall down. In fact, this version had no ladders to climb whatsoever. Next up, we have the Commodore Amiga conversion. I would like to say this played well, as it doesn't actually look that bad at all. However, as I was playing this, I did start to notice that hitting enemies was often pretty useless, as collision detection was fairly poor. A good thing was that unlike previous versions of this game, I could actually climb the ladder if I wanted to midway through the first mission. I found the controls a little non-responsive in this port when attempting to flying kick enemies. It sporadically happened without me being aware it was about to happen. Elbowing enemies seemed like that most effective way of knocking people down. A Bobo actually breaks through the wall in this port, which is a nice touch from the arcade classic. We have no music in this version, just pretty dull sounding sound effects. Not as bad as the C64 versions, but still pretty irritating. One thing that stuck out like a sore thumb was my character. Billy's face had his mouth constantly open. Kinda looked like he was constantly in shock. The scrolling on this version was a little bad too, where to progress I would have to walk very, very close to the side of the screen to get further into the stage. The Atari ST port is actually very similar, if not identical, to the Commodore Amiga's version. If I am honest, and dare I say it, the ST version was much better to control, and hitting enemies actually worked too. Graphically, it was almost identical to the Amiga's version, as so was the sound effects. Of course, no music in this version, or even garage door opening at the start of Mission 1. Something that really stood out with both this and the Amiga port are the sounds of somebody being very ill when they are being defeated. Bobo also smashes through the wall midway into this game too. Overly, a much better game to play due to better collision detection than what the Amiga had. I briefly played the Atari Lynx port in the past at some point. The first thing you will notice is that yes, the sprites are fairly big for such a small screen, such as the Lynx, but after a minute or two of playing, you kind of forget that and enjoy it for what it actually is. It is a very nice port from the source material and manages to pull off the game fairly well. The music being outputted originally from a portable mono system was very good too, complete with sound effects, although the music does drown out this just a little touch. This port even allows the players to switch difficulty levels, which is, to be fair, even on the easiest mode, I still sucked at playing this game. Double Dragon demands constant playing to perfect moves on every port. The visual side of this port is very impressive too. I have played a couple of Lynx games in the past, such as its exclusive Batman Returns, which was the packing game for the Lynx at the time, and I wasn't actually too impressed. But after playing this, I have changed my mind on the Atari Lynx. A fine example of how old school portables could laugh at console and computer ports. All I can say is that if I owned this version of Double Dragon for my Master System back in the day, I would have been very happy to play this at the time. It plays like a solid beat 'em up, collision detection is awesome, music is spot on, and sound effects are very satisfactory. You might notice that the sprites look very similar to the NES version, which isn't particularly a bad thing. Sadly, the NES game is very different to the arcade original. Thankfully, this 8-bit console port got it all right. Bobo crashes through the wall. If the branding of AAA games was a thing back in the day, this version of Double Dragon would have likely had that status. The colours used and sprite design are very well detailed. All in all, a major asset to Sega Master System fans, and this version is definitely worth playing. It actually felt like I was getting somewhere with this version, as the difficulty level was pretty well panned. The opening to the game is very impressive too, and all round just a very, very awesome port of the 1980s original arcade game. The Sega Mega Drive conversion, or Sega Genesis conversion, is very close to perfection, if not pure arcade perfection. The game is also semi-playable whilst being ridiculously difficult, as you will see from the gameplay footage. It's a good, clean and well thought of port, and really showcases what the Mega Drive or Sega Genesis could pull off in its time. The controls are sharp, the buttons are very responsive when tapping a combo to pull off a move. Sound effects are very nicely done too. Really, I am sure if I didn't know any better, I would have thought I was playing the original arcade game. Very impressive stuff, and this was obviously prior to the Sega Dreamcast being known for perfect arcade ports. A very impressive port, and it's also one of the best beat-em-ups on the Sega Mega Drive or Sega Genesis besides Streets of Rage. Next up, we have the Game Boy Advance port. If you haven't played this version, I seriously recommend it. It respects the original game but slightly modernizes it, including a few new moves which can be pretty effective at times. I also like how the screen wobbles when something smashes. Really adds to the depth of the game itself. The music is also sounding very fresh and a little more modern for the time. The controls for this version are the tightest and most responsive out of any of the versions I have played for this video, hence why my gameplay looks a lot better in this version compared to others. The game also does the awesome opening with Marianne being kidnapped and Billy and Jimmy entering the stage from the garage. The sound effects also sound like they have been given a little more oomph. The Game Boy Advance version could be the version you haven't played, which you need to play. You will see Double Dragon on the new level for sure. So that's it for today's ports video. Let me know in the comments what you think of my decisions in this video, and just like other videos I upload, remember this is all subjective and this is by no means an official list. It's just my opinion. Anyways, thanks for watching. In today's Ranking the Ports video, we are checking out Capcom's very awesome and iconic 1989 release of Final Fight. So of course, just like any other massive arcade game back in the day, we would have lots of ports. Microcomputer ports, console ports, portable system ports, and so on. And of course, just like any other famous game, we would have a plenitude of very bad ports. Make no exception, Final Fight has its fair share of very bad ports. But anyways, without further ado, let's get on with this, and we're going to start from the worst of the bunch. Now, if you want to witness a total abomination, then the ZX Spectrum version of Final Fight is the right way to go for this. Is this pretty and vibrant like the arcades game? No. Is it playable? Does it control well? No. Does it deserve an official place in one of the Spec's worst ever games? Yes. Well, yes it does. No music in bland sound effects. This yellow and black load of trash was willingly sold to excited children, knowing the horror that it would cause for them. It truly baffles me how this actually got past the publisher's standards to release this at the time. I mean, really, I understand the Spectrum's limits, I love the Specky and its charm of 80s Britishness, but good lord, this most certainly didn't go down like Manic Miner now, did it? Back in 1991, when this was released for the 128K model, this actually cost £11.99 on cassette tape. If you were lucky enough to have a disc drive, this would have cost you $16.99. A brief look at Crash Magazine issue 93 actually claims that this upcoming port would be a fast-moving beat-em-up. You have just seen the footage of gameplay. Was this really that accurate? Now, initially, I played Final Fight for the C64 several years back just to see how terrible it really was. And yes, oh yes, this version is terrible without a doubt. Firstly, the arcade original drew in crowds at the time of release, just like myself, because of its larger than life sprites. These sprites back in the day truly were amazing to see. One thing that the C64 can't do too well is large sprites, so for somebody to think this would be a good idea for the C64 was clearly somebody wanting to cash in on the big successful coin-up game. As you can see, the sprites are extremely ugly, over-pixelated. The background is also very ugly with very dull colours used. The control scheme is also fairly shabby with this port. This version does allow to choose between all three main characters, but to be fair, each character is pretty bland. Of course, no music, but very shoddy sound effects instead. Hitting enemies in this port doesn't feel satisfying like some other versions do. I'll be completely honest with you, Final Fight just didn't need to be on the C64 at all. I would have felt robbed as a kid if I had bought this port. Make no doubt about it, this 8-bit Amstrad CPC version of our beloved arcade game looks pretty good. The colours are vibrant at least. Playing and enjoying this game is a different kettle of fish altogether though. I played as Guy out of all three playable characters in this version. Guy just seemed to do what he wanted. The control scheme just seemed like it wasn't properly coded at the time. So yes, collision detection with enemy sprites was beyond lacking in that department. The game, as you can see, is incredibly slow, but not as slow as yesterday's Double Dragon video on the CPC, but nevertheless still very slow that the game feels like a chore to play rather than a memorable experience. Of course, no music or smashing down barrels to enter you into the slum stage. You are just plonked on the spot and away you go. Again, just like C64's version, the developer of this game likely knew that it was a shoddy port. I am not sure how you could say this was really playable. It's likely the type of release like C64 had, when as a kid you would pretend it was actually better than what it really was in reality. The Atari SD version of Final Fight looks good, but it really isn't a great game to play. Once enemies attack you as a gang, it is very tough to escape. Normally a special move can get away from situations like this in better ports, but the ST game plays so slow that controls just don't feel like they're responding to the button requests that you're making. As you can see through the gameplay, the game stutters as we move right to progress further into the stage. The ST version features its own theme tune for missions, which is a constant loop which easily gets annoying. You can however select and play as one of the three characters in this version, as of which I played as Guy. No sound effects by the way on this port, it's just not a good conversion, nor is it particularly fun to play. Of course, sprites are bigger than the 8-bit counterparts, but still doesn't do the game much justice. Collision detection is of course sporadic at best, or so it seems. Just a really terrible port, avoid this one. To be fair, the Amiga version of Final Fight isn't as bad as some will make it out to be. The game is deemed that bad that a coder recently made an enhanced version of it. Yes, by far not perfect, and yes, the control scheme is pretty messy. For example, the jump kick, you need to be moving whilst pressing the action button, which is pretty strange. Problem is that I found myself jumping more than I needed to. Color-wise, the source material by Capcom is a fairly vibrant looking game. The Amiga port is fairly washed out though. The boss at the end of stage 1 who whistles doesn't whistle to call his chums around. In fact, he doesn't jump backwards onto the wall either whilst his gang attacks you. That awesome part where enemies walk out of doors to fight you is also missing, and there is no introduction to stage 1 either. Instead, the game randomly starts and places you direct into a fight without any warning at all. Collision detection is average, not perfect by any means. The Amiga version by far could have been a lot better than this, especially given how colourful some Amiga games are. The conversion also lets you choose between 3 characters, just like the arcade original did. Now don't get me wrong, I think the SNES version or Super Famicom conversion is pretty great, but it's not without some flaws. Firstly, only 2 characters are playable in this version, which are Cody and Hagar. If you want to play as Guy, then the other version, which is Final Fight Guy, is pretty much the same game where you can choose between him and Hagar. Firstly, something that I noticed was slowdowns when the game becomes too busy with more than 3 to 4 sprites on the screen at once. But that is to be expected with some old games, and the Super NES is no exception for this. Musically, the game sounds very good, although not perfect. Collision detection is great. That feeling of hitting enemies feels right too. I originally bought the Game Boy Advance version from W.H. Smith at the time of the Game Boy Advance releasing in the early 2000s. Final Fight 1 is a slight revamp of the classic 1989 arcade game, and also features the ability to play as one of the 3 characters. The music has also had a slight modernization, and prior to boss fights we now have some dialogue complete with close-up images of the person you're about to fight. A nice added touch. Game-wise, I rated this just above SNES because in essence it is the same game and only with some slight upgrades. The colours are nice and there is no lag when several sprites are on screen simultaneously. It is a very nice port and I was happy with it at the time, regardless of the awful screen that the first generation of Game Boy Advances had. Collision detection is also solid too on the Game Boy Advance. Enemies do walk through doors, and our friendly boss at the end of stage 1 even whistles too. As much as I mentioned whistling, I do think that is what makes the first Slums boss so iconic to Final Fight. What can I say about this version of Final Fight? After all, the title of this port is actually Final Fight CD. This was, and still is, mega. Of course, games being put onto CD rather than cartridge meant that game developers could put more data on. And with this came very awesome background music, which these days sounds very typical of that era. Lame, but awesome guitar music, which kind of encapsulates that era of experimental gaming. No longer do we have to put up with MIDI sounds, we have real studio produced quality audio in stereo, Nicam stereo if you will. Now, it could be debated that visually the game doesn't look spot on like the arcade original, but it is recognisable, and collision detection is arcade perfect in my opinion. For a 16-bit console pulling off a technical Marvel arcade masterpiece from Capcom is an achievement in its own right. It's an enjoyable port and worth playing for the music alone. I am a sucker for games of this era with that, shall we say, 3DO sound. The game is mostly like the original game with enemies walking through doors, boss at the end of the first stage who whistles. So in that sense, the Sega Mega CD conversion had enough space allocation to allow all these cool features without sacrificing much. If you haven't heard of the Sharp X68000, this was a Japanese microcomputer and good lord, it produced some of the best arcade ports of its time. In fact, the Sharp X68000 was pretty much the dev kit behind the CPS-1 arcade games, which is why this port of Final Fight looks, plays, and sounds just like the real thing. Japanese kids in the early 1990s truly didn't realise how amazing they had it. Meanwhile, around the rest of the world, we were pretending with rubber keyboards and attempting to control sprites to beat up some baddies, which never quite took place properly. As for the structure of this version, it plays and opens up almost identical, if not 100% identical to the arcade version you would have played growing up back in the day. So that's it for my countdown and my top favourite ports of Final Fight. So let me know in the comments what you think of my choices, my decisions, and what I actually said about each version. Do you actually have a favourite version on a particular platform? Let us know in the comments. Thanks for watching. Today saying which is the best port, we are doing perhaps what is considered as one of the greatest run and gun games ever made. This is Ghouls N Ghosts, the sequel to Ghosts and Goblins. Considered to be one of the hardest arcade games of all time, you will rage at this game and likely shed a tear or two when dying and having to start from checkpoint far back in the game. The game is brutal, but a brilliant game that most have very fond memories of playing either in the arcade back in 1988 or at home. Surprisingly though, most of the ports are fairly decent with this game. But anyways, as always, let's start from what I consider as the worst port. What can I say about the Amstrad CPC's conversion of Ghouls N Ghosts? Firstly, this is clearly stripped back to leave the very basics from the source material. No opening introduction, which is fine given memory constraints. No music, just some sound effects which aren't particularly staggering. Very average for Amstrad CPC game of this era. In terms of gameplay, this port plays fairly well with fairly responsive controls. Punishing collision detection, I think the main problem with this version is the very dull choice of colours that the coders chose for this particular version. It's by far not the worst arcade game conversion from the Amstrad CPC, not even close in fact, but there are far better microcomputer ports in this list. Something to point out with this version, which I guess was a little annoying, was the fairly slow scrolling screen when moving towards the right to progress through the levels. Not entirely saying the Commodore 64 conversion is bad, but by far the least best out of the rest to come in this video. I did notice a couple of glitches whilst playing. For example, I am walking on a hill and I then just fall unwillingly to the bottom level. Something else which is a little off but not entirely a deal breaker is that in order to shoot enemies you need to duck down, otherwise the spears fly over enemies' heads. The game itself isn't the nicest looking version, but in true 64 style, the music produced from the awesome SID chip makes up for this with its own version of stage music, in which you can select between music or sound effects for the game itself. This is one of the games I used to play on the C64 as a kid. I remember getting fairly far with this one, if memory recalls. Yes, the difficulty level can get savage with this version, but remember, Ghouls N Ghosts is by definition notoriously hard. Lastly, enemy sprites have been toned down in this version, which isn't a bad thing either, as too many sprites on screen at once would have caused slowdown. All in all, not a horrendous conversion at all, but there are better versions to come. Despite the colour scheme and colour clash of this version, the ZX Spectrum manages to pull this game off really nicely given the Spectrum's hardware limitations. No music in this version but sound effects, which given credit to Spectrum's other arcade ports I have covered recently, the sound effects in this version are pretty good. One thing noticeable is the lack of enemy sprites where they are normally placed in the arcade version, which in effect doesn't necessarily make this a bad port at all, but much easier to play. Arthur's controls are very nicely implemented too. Having said that, the combination of shooting upwards is a little off, and did find myself jumping and shooting when I didn't want to, rather than staying still when shooting upwards like in most other versions. The game suffers no slowdown, all around a great Spectrum version that many Spectrum fans back in the day would have been very satisfied with. Now, this was the first time ever playing the Atari ST version of this game. I was surprised to hear the same in-game music as the Commodore 64's version, so the same composer, I'm guessing, who worked on both 8 and 16-bit versions. Now, this game is frustratingly difficult, but I am putting that down with not particularly best controls and a slight bit of lag every now and again. Is this the version you likely screamed and raged back at back in the day? Yes, more than likely. No introduction, or at least no introduction like the arcade version had. The choice of colours used in this version are a little on the dull side. Collision detection is fairly spot on though. I did find the hills where tentacles start appearing fairly difficult due to slowdowns and a slight delay when firing. Regretfully, the Sega Master System's port was a fairly laggy experience, considering I placed many Master System arcade ports fairly higher up in some of my videos. This game just wasn't that great as some other of the ports. Firstly, slowdowns were far too common in this port, although the game looked really nice and the controls were certainly nicely implemented too. It just seemed far too laggy to have a real enjoyable experience. Now, every other port I've played features a continuous first stage without the need of, say, exiting for a new screen to appear. That's not the case with the Sega Master System's version. As soon as we reach the bridge after the largest guillotine, the game then moves on to the second part of the stage, dividing it into two halves. I will also say that difficulty was pretty ramped up due to the slowdowns, which made it difficult to avoid being hit in many cases. The first thing which stood out with the Commodore Amiga's conversion of Ghouls N Ghosts was the music. It changed to a new soundtrack entirely, which sounded almost very sinister, which is kind of grew on me after playing the first stage of this game. In terms of controller input, I found controls very good for this port, although shooting upwards without jumping simultaneously was a little bit odd. Collision detection also seems pretty spot on with the Amiga version. In other words, every time I was hit, which was very often, it would make my armor fly off. The colours used are okay, they aren't great. I think the colour palette could have been slightly brighter, as the original Capcom game is actually fairly bright and vibrant, such as the grass. I will add that in the Amiga port we don't actually get a proper introduction, but rather it cuts straight into the game by pressing fire, and obscure piece of medieval style music playing at the introduction of the game. In terms of difficulty level, this game is very tough, just like most other versions of it. There is no sound effects with the Amiga port, just music, which could have added a little more substance if some sound effects was used. However, in most cases of Amiga games, this is generally the rule, music or sound effects. Is this port worth playing? I would say yes, a very good port with not much to complain about. Amiga users were likely more angry about the difficulty level of this version back in the day, if anything. Now, first thing you will likely notice with the PC Engine or TurboGrafx 16's port of Ghouls N Ghosts is that this version actually runs a little faster than the other versions I've covered so far, which is nice, but at recording this video at this point, I kind of got into a slower pace of moving through the game. That's not to say that is actually bad. It actually felt a little better than most of the other versions I played so far. I did encounter a slight slowdown during busy parts of the game, which is to be expected from an early days console. The game has a slight pixelated look, but didn't look overly bad. The music is very similar to the source material, and sound effects sounded very nice too. In terms of enemies, yes, this one is way up there with insane difficulty level 2, featuring the same placement of enemies just like the arcade's original. Controller wise, Arthur controls really nicely too, with a nice opener to the game. Now, although the PC Engine's conversion was pretty awesome, the Mega Drive or Sega Genesis version is just that slight better. Again, the speed isn't as slow as many others in this list. I have ranked this one a little higher as the colours and contrast used with this game are a little more to the original's authentic look. The music also sounds a little more true to the original arcade game too. Difficulty level with this version is certainly way up there too. This one does suffer a slight slowdown every now and again if you really want to be nitpicky, but really it's not that noticeable like it is in some other versions I have tested. Controls are tight in this version too, which helps when shooting up at vultures before they come down and dive at you. No introduction by the seams of it in this version, which is a real shame. This is a superb port of the classic arcade game. Colours are spot on, as so are the controls. This is one of the best versions that matches the source material in more than one way. The controller scheme is identical. For example, press up in fire, Arthur shoots upwards without having to jump. This could be pretty annoying in some of the other versions I played. Music wise, I found the music in this version to be the same as the arcades, although a little better if I'm honest. The music has a slight echo and it tends to work very well. Nice touch of added sound effects too simultaneously. In terms of difficulty, this one is pretty high up there. More Ghouls N Ghosts to kill, opposed to other versions of the game which had less enemies to kill due to memory constraints. This port also contains the original arcade game's opening too. It's just a real shame that the super graphics never took on. This seemed like a powerhouse of a console. Really, with Ghouls N Ghosts being on the Sharp X68000, was it really surprising that this would have been the best of the bunch? If you haven't seen my other videos mentioning the Sharp X68000, this machine was pretty much a dev kit for many popular Capcom arcade games, CPS games that is. A complete powerhouse of a machine, actually considered as a Japanese home computer. This port matches the arcade original nicely. Is this version as tough as the original? Yes it really is. This version's pixelation isn't as noticeable as most other ports and just looks that little bit smoother with nice tones of colour too. An absolutely flawless port of the arcade game and it's highly worth checking out. So that's it for today's which port is the best. Let me know in the comments which was your favourite port of Ghouls N Ghosts and which one you think should have ranked it number 1. Anyways, until next time, thanks for watching. Today on Which Port is the Best, we are checking out one of the arcade's classic side-scroll shoot-em-ups. This is Nemesis. I won't get into technical details, but we'll just say that the game is known as Gradius in Japan. Most of the world nowadays also refers to it as Gradius. I will likely refer to it as Nemesis through this video. Now, some of these versions are technically labelled as Gradius, although the mass majority of these in this video are titled as Nemesis, so it can get a little bit confusing from time to time. Generally known as an arcade favourite, including myself, this title actually predates R-Type by around a year and a half. The aim of Nemesis is a battle through each stage. A great game mechanic is by shooting down rows of enemies, you'll be presented with a power-up which allows the player to upgrade speed of the ship, as well as adding bombs, lasers, and much more. Anyways, as always, we are starting off with the worst of the bunch. Let's go. I found that the Amstrad CPC version of Nemesis to be the worst of all ports. Reason being is simply due to the speed of the game. As we know, the game can get very busy very quickly, but this port seems to struggle displaying just a few sprites at a time. Literally on the first wave of enemies as the game began, I could see and feel a slowdown, and this does matter when playing further into the game when you need to dodge bullets flying at you in all directions. The game itself isn't the best looking game either, particularly. It does appear to be pretty blocky starting from scratch. Rather than having a full presentation once the game loads up, we are presented with a rather mundane 1-player or 2-player in block white text. Just seems a little formal for a fun side-scrolling shoot-em-up game. Now, although this isn't necessarily a terrible version of Nemesis, it does come with some setbacks. Firstly, there is no music at all, only on the introduction screen. Just sound effects throughout the game though, so that's not entirely the end of the world though. The real problem is the visibility of bullets being flown at you. Space is obviously black. The human mind, in my case, sees white speckles, which my subconscious tells me that these are background stars. An odd way of explaining how I feel about this. Am I the only one to think this way with this particular version? Gameplay wise, I mapped my keyboards to use the letter G to use upgrades and directional fire button using my joystick. A nice flowing game with some slight lag here and there when screen is moving. It is an impressive Spectrum game for a 1987 release, so like I say, this port of Nemesis really isn't that bad. In terms of toughness, yes, this game is challenging. Power-ups when using them appear to work very nicely too, such as lasers and speed. One thing to add is that rather than naturally seeing the cave appear as you fly towards it, the cave generates in front of your eyes just like the Amstrad version did. Sadly, I felt that the Commodore 64's treatment to Nemesis could have been a little better. Firstly, music or sound effects only whilst playing the game, but just simply turn on music by pressing a certain keyboard's key to make that happen. The big noticeable difference with this version is the speed of enemy sprites. Of course, it is mandatory to shoot rows of enemies to gain power-ups, but when they are travelling at the speed of light, this is harder said than actually done. Control-wise is fine, although emulating this rather than using one of my real Commodore 64s, I was actually unable to find the key that activated power-ups, and so you'll see me here in gameplay collecting these, but not using them. The graphics are mediocre for a C64 game of this era, but nothing too special. I can spot a C64 colour palette a mile off, and this uses those almost dual colours. I think with the enemy sprites speed being toned down and slighter brighter colours used, this could have been a little higher up in this list. As slow as the NEC PC 88's version is, there is something really charming about this version. It totally reeks old school. The music is spot on and the graphics and sprites are average for this Japanese computer's version. Control and collision detection is also spot on. I actually really enjoy playing this version, but I am being analytical here. Does this closely match the arcade original? Well, the main thing that lets it down, of course, is the pace of this version. It is one of the slowest versions in this list. You might think it would be easier, but no, absolutely not. There isn't any sprite flicker when the screen becomes overwhelmed with enemies, which is a bonus. A very nice port that many should have been happy with back in the day who owned a PC 88. The MSX2 conversion of Nemesis is a solid one. Its responsive to controls, maneuvers are very good with no delay, firing as well with selecting power-ups flow very nicely too. Graphically, this is a fairly impressive looking game with nice vibrant colours used and nicely animated sprites to go with it. Is this game hard? It most certainly gets busy on screen. With this comes minimal lag, which is surprisingly impressive considering how many sprites can often appear simultaneously. The music is a lovely rendition of its source material, and with this also comes sound effects at the same time. In terms of scrolling, this version isn't that bad at all. Sprites move nicely, but there's a slight delay in revealing more of the stages as you progress. The MSX2 port of Nemesis is totally fine, although a tad bit slow due to the computer's processing power. The Sharp X1 computer's port of this game is brilliant. In fact, as chaotic as the game got, I find controlling the ship easier for some reason with this version. Music first is perfect, as well as the colours and sound effects used. Oddly enough though, for those who know about British early 1980s computers, the BBC Micro that is, the colour in this X1 version kind of reminded me of the colours used in most BBC games. Yes, this conversion isn't 100% perfection, but it is totally enjoyable game to play. By not perfect, I am talking about slower paces scrolling. Now technically, as this is slowed down, one might presume the difficulty level would be easier. It really isn't at all. This port is tough as balls. If you have yet to experience the Sharp X1's version, give it a go and see what I mean. A very good attempt indeed. The Sega Saturn's Gradius Deluxe Pack wasn't a great version. So, I know I've got a lot of Sega Saturn hardcore fans, so it seems, who subscribe to the channel, but obviously I'm doing this as my point of view. It looks nice and true to the original arcades game, but this port suffered with major delay and control response times. This made it fairly difficult to play for the obvious reasons. In a game like Nemesis, controls need to be top notch, otherwise the difficulty level is unnecessarily ramped to 100%. A real shame, as this deluxe pack could have ranked higher up in this list. Sega Saturn haters will hate, but as always I try to give a fair assessment of most aspects in these videos. The Nintendo Entertainment System's port of Nemesis is a truly solid 8-bit console game. The gameplay mechanics feel like the arcade game itself, and the music is constructed very nicely to emulate the sound of the original arcade version. The accompanying sound effects also complement the arcade game very well. The NES game, of course, suffers from sprite flicker, which is to be expected for most NES games when too many sprites are presented on screen at the same time. This isn't too off-putting if you're a NES veteran like myself. It's part and parcel of how the games are. There is no lag at all from what I have seen on this version. It is nicely presented with nicely detailed 8-bit colourful sprites. Is this port tough? It is a NES game after all. Of course this one's tough. Next up, we have got the Nintendo Wii's Virtual Console port of this. So the initial thing that struck me with this version was the colours used. As you can see in the gameplay footage, everything kind of looks like it was having a filter covering the natural colours, but this is actually how it played. Everything else played and sounded fine. Not really much more to say about this version, but there is better to come later in this list. As you can see by the gameplay, the release for the PC Engine or TurboGrafx 16 is just pretty much perfect in every way. No sprite flickering, no lagging, controls are as fluid as the source game itself, and the soundtrack even sounds like an upgrade from the original game itself in my opinion. Toughness level of this port is very similar, or so it seems, to the level of difficulty that the arcade game gave us. An amazing version of an amazing side-scroll shoot-em-up, most definitely. If you can't play the real thing, the arcade version that is, then I think this is one of the best things you can play. The OG PlayStation, or original PlayStation, also received the same treatment as the Sega Saturn. This is the Gradius Deluxe Pack. Although this version seen much better to control with no input and control delay issues, everything else was totally enjoyable experience of the original arcade game and was pretty much spot on with the source material. Now the Gradius Deluxe Pack also comes with the sequel Gradius, but obviously for this video this is just like the Sega Saturn's version, the original game we're playing here, which is very awesome. Now, surprisingly, we have another amazing version for the Japanese powerhouse machine. This is the Sharp X68000. Just like many other arcade classics, this version is way above others and way ahead of its time too. I have said before in other videos, whilst most of the world were pressing down on rubber key maps, the Japanese had an almost near perfect experience at home if they were fortunate enough to own one of these beasts. The visuals and sound does all the speaking here yet again. is the X68000 port hard? Yes, it is. It really is. Now, some will see the Sharp X68000 games as cheating, as these are widely known to be perfection in most cases. And so for that reason, I have chosen the next version of this game on a platform outside of the Sharp X68000. I've decided to choose the PSP port as #1 position in my humble opinion to be the very best version of the game outside of the original 1985 release. The one thing I love about the PSP's Gradius collection is that not only is it a perfect port of the original, but it's also in what appears to be a larger gameplay screen. And as you can see in the gameplay footage, it looks a lot wider and there just seems to be more room to move around in. Everything is almost identical to the original, and the original music and sound effects is also incorporated too. After defeating the first boss, the pixelation has also been slightly blurred so it doesn't look too messy. A small upgrade, if you will. So that's it. What do you think about my choices? Now, before you start commenting and saying the Sega Saturn version should be there, the PC Engine version should have been higher up, remember this is all subjective opinions. So this isn't no official countdown. This is my personal opinion. So just remember, my opinions isn't yours. Anyways, until next video comes, thanks for watching. In March of 1991, the world was introduced to a sequel by Capcom so massive at the time that it continues to this very day with the recent release of Street Fighter 6. Now, for those thinking only a few sequels have appeared since 1991, you would be very wrong. We have had Alphas, Supers, Zeros, Turbos versus Marvel versus Capcom. The list is truly endless. I won't even go into the Street Fighter movie. In my mind, you are either a Mortal Kombat or a Street Fighter player. I was strictly Street Fighter and first played Street Fighter 2 Turbo Edition, which was the packing game which I had with my Super Nintendo for Christmas in 1993. But today, prior to Turbo, we had the original Street Fighter 2 World Warrior, which is of course spawned many versions on many systems, which we are checking out today in this video. Be prepared to see Street Fighter 2 like you likely have never seen it before. I am not going to talk about each single version of the game in this video, as to be fair, around the PS2 generation, these ports were literally arcade perfection, so really is no need of doing this. But anyways, let's get on with this video. We will begin by checking out this piece of work for the ZX Spectrum. As you can see, this truly is a pitiful attempt to cash in with the massive success and hype of the original arcade game. It's very clear to most people that the ZX Spectrum simply could not pull off a fast-paced game of this magnitude. Now, this version is actually running on 128K Model 2, and even with that Spectrum upgrade, the game looks terrible, plays terrible, to the point where I just stopped playing it altogether. Many Spectrum games have around 2 to 4 colours max at the same time as some colour clash, which hardened 8-bit microcomputer fans are used to, just like myself. But this just doesn't work on so many levels in this case. I just don't need to say much more. The gameplay says it all. I mean, the brains behind this port, which is of course the one and only US Gold, released this in '93. Let's be honest, most have moved on to at least 8-bit console at this point, whilst US Gold were still knocking around with quick cash grabs like this version. In this fight, I was up against E-Honda, which wasn't surprising. In this case, the computer had more of an idea what was going on than I actually did. I will add though that this version did include all 8 characters to play. Prior to the Atari ST version launching into my first fight, in this case, I was up against Ken in the USA. I thought this would be an okay port, and then the characters started moving around and all hope was totally gone. Firstly, although sound effects and music are incorporated, it sounds a little like the ST beginning to die a very slow death. Music was choppy and seemed like a combination of Street Fighter 2 intro music with some random music chucked in with it. Collision detection is okay if you happens to be the computer who was fighting against a human player. Every now and again I would get lucky and punch or kick Ken. Street Fighter 2 isn't good with slow speed, and this is proof. Its potential of pulling off special moves admittedly work better when you have several buttons and triggers to play with. The ST just doesn't cut this at all. I think the icing on the cake with this is that US Gold published this nonsense back in '93. It is not fun to play at all. Although all 8 characters from Capcom's original game are here, it really is pointless. Controls are so bad with this game, it might as well be broken. I once had this on the Amiga back in the day. It had around 4 discs, but one of those discs was broken, so never did get around to playing it. This monstrosity was released by, wait for it, yes, US Gold back in 1992. This was for ECS as well as older OCS model Amigas. Neither was particularly wonderful. Firstly, my character of choice has and always been Ryu, and has remained since. Ryu is extremely awkward to control in this, whilst I was put up against Chun-Li. I was attempting to pull off special moves but simply did not happen. The colours looked like they had been faded away from age, or did this port always look this dull? One redeeming feature is voice, and that sounds fairly similar to the arcade original. Collision detection was just a mess. I found sometimes I hit Chun-Li to find that the health bar didn't even decrease. It's tragic to see such a capable machine that was once so far ahead of anything else was reduced to this trash. It's not particularly an enjoyable version to play either, but I suppose for those who didn't have a Super Nintendo or a Super Famicom back in '92, you would have possibly loved this just to say you had a copy of it. Who knows, I checked through Amiga Power magazine issue 22 from 1993, and they actually said, and I will quote, "I reckon you're going to be impressed with this." And then they had the cheek to score this 74% too. Although the Commodore 64's version of Street Fighter 2 is by no means any good at all, at least it is actually playable to an extent on this platform. Likely the easiest game of all time with no skill involved at all, an annoying loop of the character selection screen which plays throughout the entirety of this version. Ugly and over-pixelated backgrounds and sprites, controls are responsive enough, and hit detection is a little sporadic. I put very little effort into defeating E Honda and Blanca during my fights. You could literally finish this game with your eyes closed. Your opponents deal you very little damage. This pitiable conversion released in 1992, and yet again, the famous or infamous US Gold were responsible for this version. Bit of a theme going on here, isn't there? Many people likely wouldn't be aware, but there was actually a Brazilian release of Street Fighter 2 back in 1997 by Tectoy. Brazil had a huge following for the Sega Master System, well into the times of where most of us around the world was playing the first PlayStation, Sega Saturn or Nintendo 64. Is this good port though? Well, it's certainly playable and to an extent a challenge to play too. As you can see in the background's imagery is missing. For example, when I was fighting Ken in the USA, the boat and people are all missing. This was likely to allow for a faster game itself by saving as much memory as possible on the cartridge. Obviously, the Master System only had 2 action buttons, and this wasn't as good as the next version on this list to pull off combos. It is a fairly fast game though, which surprised me. Musically, sounds much like the original, only in the 8-bit form. Surprisingly, the IBM DOS conversion was actually fairly playable. Normally in these arcade ports videos that I upload, DOS versions are often worse than the Atari ST and Commodore Amiga ports. Not the case for Street Fighter 2 though. Now, not exactly perfect. The noticeable thing is, like some other versions, we have a constant loop of different music playing throughout. Sadly, these aren't exclusive for each fighter's location like the original arcade version had. It does get a little annoying after a couple of minutes. Gameplay wise, although a little slow, it is playable and does present a fair good challenge. This is the US Gold version of this game for DOS, which is often praised. It was released back in 1992, and there was me thinking US Gold was terrible and notorious for publishing bad Street Fighter 2 conversions. This is testament that US Gold wasn't all that bad at all. Finally, we have arrived to the point where a port of Street Fighter 2 was half decent to play, an actual challenge in fact. The OG Game Boy version was like music to my ears. This 8-bit portable port firstly featured music which matches the source arcade game, a different track for each fight that is. This version actually meant I had to put some effort into winning a fight against Ryu in Blanca when I was put up against them. But is this actually a good version? Yes, it isn't bad at all. I would have been fairly impressed as a kid with this version if I didn't already have it on the Super Nintendo. I will mention here that US Gold wasn't responsible for this port, hence why we got a better version for the Game Boy. One thing to note here is that Street Fighter requires several different button combinations, and with only an A and B button with a D-pad, the OG Game Boy managed to pull this off really well. Graphically, for a Game Boy game, it looks good, and collision detection actually feels good in this version too. This was also a fairly late release for the OG Game Boy, being released back in 1995.
Round one, fight! You're playing!
Now, it's not surprising that the 1992 release of Street Fighter 2 on the Super Nintendo or Super Famicom was a cut above the other ports in this list so far. Firstly, this one was actually brought to us by Capcom. Firstly, the game pretty much plays the same as the arcade original, sounds much like it too, controls just like it. This is a seriously impressive 16-bit console port. The colours and collision detection are spot on, the music and sound effects are also extremely good for this. I would imagine that, being Capcom's baby, they needed to ensure that its own console version matched the greatness of its arcade game. It also meant that new users of the Super Nintendo or Super Famicom would have a near perfect version of the arcades game too around a year after when the console itself was released. Many were impressed with this version back in the day, as well as myself when I eventually played it after owning the Street Fighter 2 Turbo Edition. I fought against Dhalsim and Chun-Li, and it truly felt like I had a challenge on my hands with this version. Awesome stuff. You might wonder why Sega Mega Drive or the Genesis never had this version. It had the Champion Edition, but never featured World Warrior, which is what we're looking at in this video.
Round one, fight!
Street Fighter 2 World Warrior is actually included on the Capcom Generation 5 disc. Surprisingly, the Saturn version is pretty much 100% spot on. It plays well, very responsive to controls, and collision detection is also very much spot on. Great music and sound effects with this version too. Colours used with this Saturn version do appear to be slightly darker than the next version of this.
You'll be there!
Street Fighter Collection 2 contains the original Street Fighter 2 World Warrior, whereas the Sega Saturn didn't have this edition. Only one collection that didn't contain World Warrior. This port of the game is pretty much identical to the Sega Saturn's version, apart from what appears to look brighter in the PlayStation version. Again, good control response, great music and sound effects, very close if not 100% perfect to the original arcades game. I chose this one in a higher place, and like I say, between the Sega Saturn and the OG PlayStation version, there wasn't much difference, so I chose PlayStation 1 because this system means a little bit more to me. And my favourite port of Street Fighter 2 World Warrior is featured on the Capcom Classics Collections Reloaded pack for the PSP. This is a great version of the game. It's placed into a wider format, and so more of the game areas are visible compared to the typical 4:3 aspect ratio in the other versions of this video. This is by default, so I didn't mess around with video settings. The game itself is good as it looks. It's smooth, fast and very responsive. Of course, the PSP had several buttons to complement each action that you try and pull off in the game. Music and sound effects are also included too, so a very good port of the game all in all, and it also features those bright and vibrant colours that the original arcades game had. And that's it for today's Street Fighter 2 arcade ports, worst to best. So let us know in the comments which your favourite version is, and do you actually agree with how I rank these? Just remember, be friendly, everyone's opinion is very different, and this is by far not an official ranking list. Until next video, thanks for watching. As a kid in the early 1990s, I remember being on holiday in Weymouth at a Haven Holidays Park, and I recall a good few people crowded around an arcade machine. Of course, at this point, Golden Axe was a good few years old, but the machine was still standing proud. Two kids were defeating Death Adder on the final stage, and this warranted many to crowd around and watch the end screens, as well as myself. I would play this on the C64 back in the day, and later on the Sega Master System and my brother's Sega Mega Drive. Golden Axe has had a few sequels and spin-offs, including Axe Battler on the Game Gear, as well as a so-called reboot during the PS3 era, which epically failed. Today's video is a celebration of one of arcade's best beat-em-ups of all time. This video is going to explore the very worst, best ports, which were available during these old systems commercial years. I'll also note here that just like my other videos in this series, I aim to set these between 10 to 15 minutes long in length. If there is a missing port, I truly do apologise. Anyway, let's rock on. First up, we've got the Amstrad CPC. Now, although there is much worse in terms of arcade conversions on this miracle 8-bit Amstrad CPC, this version of Golden Axe just isn't much fun at all. More frustrating more than anything. Firstly, sprites are way too fast and collision detection is very much off, where it is so difficult to attack enemies. They seem to get the better of you most of the time rather than you getting the better of them. In typical CPC fashion, we get those nice vibrant contrasty colours, but for Golden Axe it is just a little far too bright. Each character is playable, just like most of the other computer ports in this list. To jump requires pressing up on D-pad and very quickly pressing the action button. As I have been going through this ports series, I actually had low expectations for the ZX Spectrum conversion of Golden Axe. I was actually really surprised with how good it was, considering this computer was at this point 8 years old, and Sinclair Research had no idea that people would later use a computer to produce games to this caliber all of this time later. Firstly, there is no music, just some pretty average sound effects, which is more than acceptable for a specky game. Another thing that I did notice was no clear colour clash. For example, as I played as Tyrus Flare, I noticed that the background wasn't displaying spin on her, which tells me this game was programmed by a very talented coder back in the day. Controller wise, it controls fairly well with collision detection that is mediocre. Nothing to brag about. It is also a fairly tough version of Golden Axe. This is a game I would play on my Commodore 64 back in the day. At the time I was more than happy playing this, although a little tough compared with other versions in this list. This was good, if not decent attempt by Virgin Games when they released this back in 1990. I had the Tronics release of this. Now, out of all versions of Golden Axe, I'll personally say that the music produced by Jerome Tell for this version is by far the very best, if not underrated. I am an absolute sucker for synth music and love the power of the synth chip. Music wise, you can choose between music or sound effects, which is acceptable for a game like this on C64. Gameplay wise, like I say, although a little tough, the collision detection is very slightly off, and to jump means an odd controller combination, just like other versions of pressing up and fire simultaneously. The game tends to stick with a particular colour and use different shades of it. For example, lots of browns are used. It's not particularly the ugliest conversion. I'm pretty sure that one goes to Final Fight on the C64. The strange thing with the Sega Master System's version of Golden Axe is that the only character we can play with is Tarek. Although you do have 3 options of magic to choose from before the game begins, very annoying for fans of the other characters in the game. Firstly, the quality of this conversion isn't that special. We will notice the game lags and stutters. Characters also appear to be very much the same as they walk and run around on screen. The stuttering is also irritating as the sprites move very quickly in this version. I owned this one back in the day for my Master System too, but didn't really realise how bad it was up until recently. I have seen much better on the Sega's 8-bit console. Collision detection is fairly bad too with this version. Just seems that the weapon you are using don't seem long enough to have a good aim of attacking enemies. If I had to choose something good from the Master System's version, I would likely say the colour palette used isn't that bad. Now, the Atari ST version of Golden Axe isn't too wonderful. Firstly, and most annoyingly, every now and again when scrolling, the game will pause for a few seconds to load a little bit more from the disc, which happened several times during my playthrough of the first stage, which was the wilderness. Secondly, collision detection is way off in this version. Music wise, for a 16-bit micro game, it kind of sounds just like an 8-bit version. Although the sound effects are fairly good with this port, the music is pretty bad. I think that the color palette used for the Atari ST's version appears to be just a little bit too bright, but that's just me. Overall, not particularly a great conversion over on the Atari ST. There is much better to come in this list. Now, optimistically, I fired up this Japanese PC Engine CD port of Golden Axe. Was really impressed with the presentation of it. A slick new look, really. The sound was different to the usual, and the character selection screen looked a little like something from Streets of Rages. The score in hand selection screen is gone in this version. The game opens up with a nice introduction too. Then the game begins, and I am slightly underwhelmed. Okay, sure, at the end of the day, this is still a game version from 1990. But still, there were other versions much better than this released in 1990. The issue with this game is firstly an odd level of difficulty. Enemies seem very easy to defeat. Not much effort is involved, and it randomly bumps up 100% when you're not expecting it. Almost like this was purposely done to catch the player off guard. I'm not really sure. The characters themselves also seem to walk at a seriously fast pace, unlike other versions here in this video. Is this a good port? Well, it is cut above the previous versions I have covered so far, but definitely not a perfect version at all. This Japanese portable produced a very good version of Golden Axe, which is very colourful and detailed for the sprites in really nice backdrops, complemented with a very nice soundtrack with added sound effects. It originally released in 2002, so at this point around 13 years have passed since the original arcade release, and just went to show how loved this classic was even at this point. It's a fairly nice game to control, but did find this port extremely difficult to play. Difficulty level have truly ramped up 100% with this Bandai WonderSwan colour version. If you can, give this one a go. It's likely you haven't played this version or even knew about the WonderSwan Color Portable. You can also choose between any 3 of the original characters too with this version of the game. Providing you had a good IBM or PC compatible computer back in the day, you had a fairly good version of Golden Axe. This is running through DOSBox and was set to output through VGA at 256 colours. As you can see in the footage, it really doesn't look bad like some other DOS conversions that I have covered so far in this series. You will see some screen flicker, and this is likely down to disk image that I was using. Controller wise, this isn't too bad. It tended to be very slightly delayed. Color wise looks very nice. It's not too bright and not too dull either. Nicely added music with sound effects which works together whilst playing the game. Although the music did sound a little distorted at times. Collision detection isn't perfect, but there have been much worse on this list so far. Now, for owners of the Commodore Amiga 500 back in 1990, you would have rejoiced that you finally owned a fairly decent arcade conversion. This version is a faithful port, which a lot of care and attention went into by Virgin back in 1990. So, what made this port so good? Well, firstly, as much as the arcade game is a classic undeniably, the Amiga version is ever so slightly faster. For example, when Julius Thunderhead, who I was playing as in this version, got hit down, it just seems just that little bit quicker to get back up and get back into the game. Enemies also appear to walk and run a little faster too, but not too much faster to the point which other versions of this list has had. Music and sound effects was also added without the need of selecting here just one of these. All 3 characters are playable in this version too, and casting magic spells also looks really cool with this version. Visually, the game looks really nice with a nice touch of perfect collision detection when hitting the baddies. So is the Sega Mega Drive or Sega Genesis conversion of the 1989 arcade classic the definitive version of this game? I certainly think so. This is likely the version I played most of too on my brother's Sega Mega Drive 2 back in the day. Of course, each one of the characters is selectable, and of course the game is pretty much perfect in every way possible. Truly a Mega Drive classic, and most people at least own a standalone copy of this game on their Mega Drive, or at least had it on the Mega Games 2 compilation cartridge, which seemed as equally as common to own back in the day. First thing to mention here is clearly obvious. This game is on CD, and of course the music quality is much superior than its Mega Drive or Sega Genesis counterpart. When the Sega Arcade Classics collection was put together for the Mega CD or Sega CD, the games had some new audio treatments to go with them. The music for Golden Axe is actually from the arcade original. The voices used are redubbed as a higher quality too. You can also really hear the difference when enemies die in this version of Golden Axe. This is a great version, if not perfect version, which matches the source material very accurately. Colouring used included shades are amazing. Sprites look very nicely coloured too. Now in terms of putting the Mega CD in first place, it's a matter of choice really. Both this version and the previous Mega Drive or Genesis versions are virtually the same. The only difference is audio, and the point of this video is to determine the best and closest port next to the original. So anyways, that's it for for today's Golden Axe Ports video. This is actually the 10th video now in this series, and just remember, this is not an official list, this is my opinions in my personal ranking, so please be nice in the comments, as you normally are anyway. Should I say any more? Anyways, thanks for watching. Today, by request, we are checking out one of 1989's best arcade hack and slash games, that is Strider. A quick rundown: if you are unlikely familiar with the premise of Strider, it is loosely based around a manga and features a dystopian world controlled by the evil Grandmaster Mayo, in which the character Hiryu of the Strider organization has vowed to end this and restore peace for humanity. Every time I have played Strider over the years, I have instantly thought of a Neo-Russia setting, for some reason or another. Now, let's point some things out. Most, if not all, of the home computer conversion ports are by the notorious US Gold. Why? Because that's how it was, and most 8-bit micro magazines could make terrible ports look like the best thing since sliced bread. Again, like always, if a particular port isn't included, I sincerely apologise, but these are the main versions regardless. I will also point out that this video will focus on direct arcade conversions, and so the NES version, for example, won't be included because of its difference. Neither will reboots such as the very awesome 2014 reboot, that is. I will also not include the Sharp X68000 version, as many think that is unfair comparison. Anyways, let's go. So, despite the black and white monochrome for the 1989 Spectrum version, jumping actually feels and looks good compared with the next version, that is. Entering the game on the glider looks very nice, but due to the lack of background, just doesn't give it much substance or depth. But in this case, I'll forgive the specky for that. This is running on the 128K model Spectrum, and first thing noticeable is a ridiculously tough level of difficulty in this version. I can generally finish the first stage playing the arcade original without losing any lives. I was lucky enough to get to the first halfway boss without having to continue, which brings me to the next point. Instead of flames raining down on you after that brief encounter, when they come down on you incrementally, the whole lot comes down in one go, which I wasn't expecting. I think the game isn't that bad actually. It controls nice, and collision detection is very nicely done from what I have played. It's just a difficulty level and lack of background which I think does this conversion a little bit of damage. Without a background, there doesn't seem to be any perception of where you are once you jump off from roofs. I will also note here that when destroying enemies, they do not slice in half but just explode. Shame really, this could have been a solid port with a little more work put into it. There really isn't much to like about the 1989 CPC version. Quite literally, the only reason I rank this after the ZX Spectrum port is simply that this had colour to it. It seems too difficult for its own good, just like the Spectrum version did, but surprisingly, if you can get past how the Spectrum version looks, then stick with that port. No music with Amstrad CPC's conversion, just some bleak sound effects. Talking about colour, the actual colours used in this game just look nasty in my opinion. Although the entrance seems a minuscule little better than Spectrum's, it's just not enough to say the entrance sequence is anything special at all. It would have taken the coder a few seconds just to type in AD 2048 to give it that arcade feel. Sadly, many of these ports missed it. To you it might seem sad, but to me it really sets the scene collision wise, and controller is much like Spectrum's version 2. I think one of the ugliest parts of that Amstrad game is that when killing enemies they explode into a horrible shade of orangey brown. Typical colours for the 1970s, but let's face it, this game came out in 1989. So where do I begin with the C64's problems with this 1989 Strider conversion? We shall start by mentioning that unintentionally, Hiro tends to slide across the floor from time to time, in which case this is almost impossible to break that slide, or so it seems so. Secondly, most of the enemy sprites and even power-ups are missing from this game. Jumping in somersaults and climbing up walls just doesn't seem to dazzle much in this conversion. We can have music on or off during gameplay, which is fine. It's a C64 game after all. Difficulty level for this port is pretty cruel. Whether or not US Gold has a team of sadists working on this game at the time is not known, but it wouldn't surprise me. The boss midway after defeating him should have a bunch of flames that you need to hide in cover from. Not in this version. After defeating him, I was in a hurry to take cover, but wasn't any point really. Something that happened more after than not with the C64 port is frame rate drop every now and again. This tended to happen when slashing enemies. Music, of course, for our beloved SID chip with the C64 is pretty much top notch. In the graphics as well as sprites are not bad at all, but the game and mechanics itself really isn't that special. Much like the previous versions, this 8-bit 1991 Sega console port just needed that little bit of more care, and it could have been something so much better. Difficulty level isn't so bad in this version. Likely reason being is that there isn't much to deplete your life with. In other words, where are the enemies? Enemy sprites don't seem to be around much in this conversion. The iconic opening where you fly into the first mission is also missing, which is pretty bad, to me anyway. That is one of the coolest things about the original arcade game. Color wise, nice use of Master System color palette, and sprites level design are very nice too. Almost metallically colors used in this. This even included the halfway boss and fire scenario. Overly an easy port with nothing much to write home about. There's been a lot better on the Sega Master System. Despite the lack of music with the IBM PC compatible 1989 release, this is actually a fairly good conversion. Yes, the sound effects are very bad, but gameplay wise is solid, and including the awesome acrobatic jumps which are also nicely implemented in this version. Slicing enemies with the cipher also looks very nice in this too. There was a very slight delay using DOSBox for this, and I'm not sure if this is how it originally played. Overall, by far not the worst of the ports of Strider, but again, just really seems that a little more added work to this could have made a full difference. Atari ST users had a very good port of Strider back in '89, although on the punishing side and with slightly smaller gameplay screen compared to the next version in this video, the gameplay is actually pretty solid in this, including very awesome looking acrobatic jumps, and also the slicing enemy animations are nicely done too with the ST version. Color wise is very nice with some darker contrast use, and collision detection is pretty much spot on there. This also features a nicely animated introduction to the game too. All in all, a nice conversion with music included that is acceptable but not as good as the next version. On the surface, the Commodore Amiga 1989 conversion actually plays well and looks very faithful to the source material too. Music and sound effects are included simultaneously, and it also features the iconic flying in scene before Mission 1 begins, complete with the AD 2048 text appearing. Again, much like the other ports in this video, the game is seriously let down with the incredible difficulty level of this. Collision detection when attacking enemies is pretty good, and jumping also looks pretty well too. More enemy sprites are in this version, which makes it seem a little bit more authentic to what it's imitating. Something which the Amiga port did perfectly was the laughing sound when you die. It came complete with the animation too. Overall, an average port, but nothing groundbreaking like yesterday's version of Golden Axe. This 1990 Mega Drive or Sega Genesis port is so close to the source material was unreal, but yeah, smooth as butter to play. Sure, this is a tough game, in fact seemed a little tougher than the arcade original. More importantly, Hiryu looks authentic to the original arcades game when he jumps in somersaults in the air. When sliding across the ground, it's totally controllable, unlike the pitiful C64 version, when he just wants to avoid getting upwards together. As you can see in the footage, colours are also spot on, and the animation when he dies also looks very awesome too. Mega Drive or Sega Genesis fans would have undoubtedly been very chuffed with this release. This port also featured all the original sprites, and so nothing was actually missing. If you want to be technical, the only slight downgrade, if that's what you want to call it, is that this version's native resolution is a fraction lower, but it really doesn't show much. Lastly, this wasn't put out by US Gold, but none other than Sega, and that's why we got a good version for the Mega Drive or Sega Genesis. Capcom Classics Collection Remix featured a port of Strider for the PSP. Now this is pretty much arcade perfect, only it's obviously for a portable version. I've included a portable release of it as Game Boy had no port at all, and the Sega Game Gear appears to only had Strider Returns, which was a sequel. There isn't much to say about this conversion, as at this point it was released back in 2006. The hardware was clearly strong enough to produce arcade quality, if not better. A nice feature to this though is that we can choose between aspect ratios from original to stretched. The PSP version is also less pixelated than others, which is a bonus for those who don't like that retro look as much. It's very unusual for me to say that a mirror port is better than the original arcades version, but in this case I'll happily make an exception. That's for the 1994 PC Engine CDs version. It's much like the original 1989 game with solid gameplay and visuals that match the original material really well. In fact, the PC Engine CD version seemed much more smoother to play, and without a doubt the soundtrack or background music just goes so well with this conversion. It's actually made the game feel much better to play in my case. Something else this had was a proper, almost cinematic opening with a little FMV-esque going on. Now of course the version was on CD, and so more data allowed to enhance audio. If you have yet to experience this version of Strider on the PC Engine CD, seriously give this one a go, and you'll likely agree that even flying into the first mission sounds so much better. Now, if you want pure arcade perfection, look no further than the OG PlayStation's port of this game. This port was originally launched back in the year 2000. It's a freebie for the release of Strider 2 for the PS1. It was actually on a separate disc. It was later released again as a standalone game, complete with manual and even strategy guide. There are certain differences with this release, but not the type of differences that make it a different game altogether. In fact, just some slight enhancements, if you will. A button for auto-fire was added, as well as a dedicated button for sliding around. This version also allowed us to disable the timer by option. Musically, this version also slightly enhanced sounds, which includes elements from the original 1989 arcades game. And that's it for today's Strider various ports video in ranking those. So just remember that this is my personal opinion and what I personally rank. So be nice in the comments as always, I know you will be. And let us also know which your favourite port of Strider was in some memories. Have you got any memories of this game at all? Anyways, until next video.